everything in our lives is an iteration. And whether you're talking about the scriptures or whatever you want to talk about, it's an evolution. It's a line by line. It's a step by step. And that gives us a key to history. It's been a crazy week. It's been a crazy month. As we talked about last time, what we want to do is kind of reset and start from the beginning, which makes it, I think, a little bit easier as we start to look at some of the other history things. And it's still about the why. It's still about the answering the question of what happens in all of these events. And so we're going to start at the early point in America's history, and we're going to divide this up. So today we'll cover certain things in the history, but I want to be over the next several series covering everything through the beginning of the United States, through the Constitution, talk about the Federalist Papers, talk about the Constitution itself. The Constitution is really simple. I mean, it's so simple. I mean, you could literally read it in 10 minutes. Maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter, but it's so simple. And there's only 7 articles, and out of the 7 articles, there's only 3, 4 that are really detailed, and the rest of them are just kind of add-ons. What I want to do, though, is start in the beginning. American Foundation. Now, this is my favorite saying. I say it all the time because it is so applicable in life. Everything in our lives is an iteration. And whether you're talking about the scriptures or whatever you want to talk about, it's an evolution. It's a line by line. It's a step by step. And that gives us a key to history. We see nothing happens just bam, and it comes out of nowhere. Everything is being put together. I think I mentioned last time there were 2 quotes that were really fun. I want to talk about them again. One was by J.P. Morgan, and that was the one where he said, "A man should always have 2 reasons for doing anything. A good reason and the real reason." And everything we see, particularly in politics, revolves around that. The other great one is, in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet that it was planned that way. Okay? So everything we've been seeing, I'm going to deviate a little bit to some current history. The riot at the Capitol building. It was not spontaneous. It was planned. Now, who planned it? I think there, again, as we've talked about, multiple agendas, multiple egos, multiple reasons and people getting involved. You don't know what you don't know until you know it. We find ourselves in that position right now, and we need to, in our personal lives, answer a lot of questions about, where's our country going? Where are things going? How do we know where it's going? We're way out here. Janice and I were talking about, you kind of feel a little lost. What do we do? What can we do? How can we influence what's going on in the world? I think as we go through this and we talk about history and we talk about what happened in the past, we can draw some correlation about what's going to happen in the future, and maybe start to place ourselves in that future and know where we stand and how we move in that future. So beginning, first thing we'll talk about, British colonies to the United States. Now I'm using that in lower caps. And if you'll notice in the Constitution and all the early documents, United States was not capitalized. Okay? And that was kind of significant. We're talking about a federation of colonies and states, and we'll get into that a little bit. The first flag is the original flag of the colonies. And of course, this one. It came up after the Revolution. So we'll go through that. In the future, we're also going to talk about federalism and the Constitution, and we'll do a little definition on that today and talk about the basic structure. And then later on, becoming states. All of this comes together to start to give us the history. And as we move into the Civil War and all of the events, we start to see the patterns, and we start to see how it is that things became what they are today from what they were then. There's a correlation that's really interesting. Deviate just a second. World War II. World War II was basically a direct result of many iterations from the Napoleonic Wars, which happened 150 years prior to World War II. But the precedents and a lot of what happened in World War II was actually set up in those late 1700s, early 1800s. And the events that happened back there were sometimes referred to the butterfly effect. A little tweak here is a huge tweak here. And so we have to look at that in terms of our own country and what's happening. This was our country in 1750. Colonies on the East Coast. Spain had a lot of the Caribbean, South America. There was some British and French. France claimed everything down through the middle of the country. The grant to the Hudson Bay Company, and even the Russians over on the other side. Interesting hodgepodge of everything. Now you can see today all the influences from these different countries that impacted various parts of the United States and why they did. A lot of disputed territories, a lot of fighting, and that reflects on the history of early America. So here's a timeline I want to talk about for a little while. We all think about, everything in 1776. What we don't realize is that everything in 1776 was just the last chapter. It was the 100+ years before that that really set the stage. Now, kind of think of your own life and think of the last 50 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever is applicable of your life and what you know and what you've experienced and how you've gone through it. And then kind of map that to if you lived in this time period and what your thoughts were and how you lived. The various points in your life that you've experienced. Some remember the Kennedy assassination. Some remember the 9/11. All of these points. Well, back in this time period, these people had these points in history too in their lives, and they were real, and they impacted how they thought and how they felt about everything that was going on. So let's go back to the first, 1651, the Navigation Acts. Now, Britain was always playing with its colonies. And all of these acts that you see generally had an economic impact. That's what they were all about. They were about power, control, money. Whichever one you talk about, we can go into great detail about them, but that's not the point. The point is that you had people from another place trying to control the people in the colonies, one way or the other. The Navigation Acts were the first, basically trying to control what happened in the country. King Philip's War, or the First Indian War. Now, King Philip was one of the Native Americans, and he was referred to as King Philip. He was an ancestor of the Indians that were friendly to the Plymouth settlement and many of the early colonists. But over that 40+ year period, things had kind of changed. So we end up with the First Indian War. Now, it was really kind of a British war, but the colonists had to fight it. Okay? What sort of impact does war have on people, on their minds, on their families? A lot of people died. A lot of things happened in that First Indian War. It was the first time that the colonists just felt a little bent out of shape and being used. Okay? Not a big thing. Didn't change much. Colonies were still very small at the time. You didn't have a lot of people that were very wealthy. But it had an impact. It had an impact on the psyche of the culture, which started to carry forward. Then we get another point, the Molasses Act. Molasses. Well, molasses was an important commodity at the time. Again, another economic burden that was tried to be put on the colonists. Another small impact. Each one of them just kind of tweaking the situation. Things start to pick up. Now we get to 1754, 1763. So, 54 to 63, 9 years of war. We know how long World War II was. This was 9 years of war. Had a huge impact. Now we're talking about the generation that's actually going to be in the revolution. Look at those time periods and compare them to your lives and the lifespan of the individuals that are going to be involved. That's really crucial because those people now take an active role in what's happening. Now you see, in a short period of time, in about a 20-year period, think about 20 years in your life and what happens. We get a ton of things all of a sudden just happening real fast. Every other year, something is happening. We're getting the Townshend Acts, a whole bunch of things, Proclamation Acts, the Boston Massacre. Wars always start with something like the Boston Massacre. World War I, the Archduke is killed. There's a trigger point. The Boston Massacre was the trigger point. Okay. Now I'm going to back up a little bit. We're going to talk about 1754, intercolonial collaboration. Anybody heard about that before? Not taught. We don't know. What was the intercollaboration document? 1754. Why was it so important? Ben Franklin, quite a character, very wise guy. You can debate his moral issues, but the guy was smart, and the guy was very pro-colony. He says, look, as colonies, we got to figure out how to work together better. Because they were separate colonies. They had separate cultures. They had separate characters. They had separate operations, governing. But they banged heads when it came to water rights, river rights, all sorts of things. They kept running into each other. This is ours. No, this is ours. And how do you work with that? So Ben Franklin, back in 1754, says, look, we need some sort of collaboration document. We need to be able to figure out how to get along better. This, in its infancy, was the Constitution. And that's where it started, as a document. Just how do we get along? So we come along a little further, and finally, almost 20 years later, 1773, the events of the time start to say, wow, we really do need to figure out how to get along. What was that thing Ben Franklin had? Let's resurrect that again. Okay? When we hear the history of the Constitution, a lot of people go, oh yeah, it was Jefferson. He figured it out and wrote this and that. No, it was a lot of things just steaming, bubbling under the surface. And then finally you get this intercolonial committee of correspondence. I love long titles. But it was very descriptive. That's exactly what it was. Let's put committees together in each colony and let's talk to each other and try and work things out. How do we get along? How do we make things come together? 3 years before the Declaration of Independence. That is not coincidence. This was bubbling together. It was starting to become a government.